The basic idea of the levels of processing view for what gets retained in long-term memory just suggests that the more deeply we process things, the more likely they are to linger in long-term memory. And I'm annoyed that I can't get a better illustration than this graphic that's in the text on page, don't tell me. Oh my gosh, now I can't find it. It's on page 146, and it speaks of particular presidents and people's propensity to recall them. And over toward the left there, that's Lincoln. Now, this would be different than something that we might have discussed earlier called the serial position effect. Why might it be the case that Lincoln is so strongly recalled? Well, he's arguably the most single celebrated president, our 16th president out of 46, who left us in 1865, April of 65. And so you can also see that as your average Joe or Jane is trying to recall presidents, they're better at the more recent presidents. But anybody surrounding Lincoln is scarcely recalled. So, for instance, the person that came immediately before and after Lincoln, we barely remember that Andrew Johnson was number 17. So the suggestion is the more deeply I process someone, as we've processed a lot about Abe Lincoln. We know that he was from Kentucky and Illinois. We know about his leadership during the Civil War, about the hat that he wore, about the unusual countenance, that he was 6'4", a million things. He had a high-pitched voice. All of those things suggested that people process Lincoln relatively deeply, and that he's on the $5 bill and the penny and all those things. So one alternative to the modal model of memory is levels of processing. In this model, memory is thought to depend on how long material is stored, or not on how long it's stored, or the sort of storage, but whether it's deeply processed. The levels of processing approach does not suggest that different memory stores exist, but rather says that different kinds of cognitive processing that people perform when they encode things predict how well they'll be recalled. So over there on the far left, of course, is George Washington. For those of us that grew up in the United States, we know that's the first president. And we also have some incidental knowledge about Jefferson and Adams. And there were two Adamses, of course. But then it dips quite a bit. Most people can't recall some of those presidents that fell in between, like John Tyler was number 10, the namesake of Tyler, Texas. But then by the time you get to Abe Lincoln, of course, that's arguably the single most famous president, and we've processed him the most deeply. So this steps apart a little bit from that modal memory model that had short-term memory, long-term memory, and sensory memory. It takes it a step further and begins to describe why some things are remembered vividly and others aren't. So here's a clever experiment, or a couple actually. Creek and Toving performed a typical investigation. Participants were presented with a series of questions about words. Each was preceded by a question, and participants responded to the questions as fast as they could. No mention was made of memory or learning, and any learning that's not in according to that purpose was incidental. So here's one experiment. 3 kinds of questions were used. One kind asked whether participants whether the word was printed in caps or not, all capital letters. Another kind asked whether the target word rhymed with another word, a little bit deeper. And the third kind asked whether the word fit into a sentence. So the girl placed the blank on the table. That's the deepest. The 3 kinds of questions were meant to induce different kinds of processing. To answer the first kind of question, you need only look at the typeface. The second, think about its acoustic processing, whether it rhymes with another word. And the third, I had to think of its meaning. Does it fit in the sentence? And the depth of the processing was greatest for that third kind of question, and that predicted memory best, which suggests very strongly this idea of levels of processing. So they initially equated depth of processing with degree of semantic processing, but other authors, including Bauer at Stanford, in studying memory for faces, found similar results with nonverbal stimuli. Participants who rated faces for honesty showed better memory for those faces than participants who rated them just by the major two genders of male and female. So one problem with this approach, however, was pinning down the definition of what depth is. Is it semantic depth, like whether it fits in a sentence, or some other tertiary depth like honesty in faces? So other memory researchers encourage psychologists to pay attention to how encoding changes with the type of material presented. Some aspects of information seem to be encoded without effort, in which the frequency is relevant. So for instance, I remember when my family used to drive from northern Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, all the way down to Orlando. We went a few times in the 1980s to Disney World. And on the way there, you go through Tennessee and Georgia and finally into North Florida. I may have missed a state there. South Carolina, I think, is in there somewhere. But you see scores of billboards for a gas station chain called Stuckey's. And Stuckey's with a gas station, but also a really fun, convenient store where they had really delicious milkshakes and taffy and all sorts of fun things. But the sheer frequency of the Stuckey's billboards was overwhelming, and therefore you became aware of how many times that you saw them. So it may go with billboards for law firms, like the Batters Law Firm here in East Texas. You're just overwhelmed with that, and the frequency of occurrence tends to lodge into your mind, even though you're not intending to commit anything to memory. About Stuckey's, you become very familiar with it based on the sheer frequency of how often you see these things. So chances are quite good that your sense is correct. So Hasher and Zaks would explain your impression of an instance of automatic encoding. And I automatically encoded the nature of what Stuckey's was based on the sheer frequency of having seen so many billboards. So certain aspects of experience, such as frequency, have a special representation, especially if I can't get away from those things. And we'll see that this fall, when the election comes in earnest, that both major candidates are likely to have a lot of ads, and you'll be very aware of certain aspects of what they're asserting based on the sheer frequency of those ads.